They called me country boy, as if that were an insult handed down from some council of urban elites. I remember the first time it happened, back in middle school, when my accent stretched vowels and clipped consonants in ways that apparently belonged to another planet. "Did you hear him?" One of the boys snickered across the classroom. "He sounds like he rode here on a mule." And there it was, the laughter cascading over my words like a sudden downpour, soaking me in embarrassment. I laughed too, nervously, trying to convince everyone, including myself, that it was funny, that I belonged here. But inside I felt a peculiar mix of heat and frost, shame and stubbornness locked in a I remember my English teacher, Ms. Holbrook, asking me to read aloud, and every word I pronounced seemed to wobble under the spotlight of her gaze. Each rolled like a lazy river, each stiff thing stretched beyond the comfort zone of my classmates' ears. I could hear their muffled giggles, and I imagined them sketching cartoon versions of me in their notebooks, exaggerating my mouth movements, my country inflections. It was humiliating, yes, but oddly intimate. The way my voice clung to their attention felt like the first, unintentional stage of a performance. I didn't know it then, but the sound of my own speech would later become the weapon of my quiet revenge. Lunch breaks were worse. They whispered across tables, making me the subject of tiny, cruel competitions. "Betty can't even order a burger correctly," one would joke, watching me stumble over simple phrases like they were high-wire acts. I laughed with them occasionally, a desperate act of camouflage. I learned early how to tilt my head just right, how to flash a half-smile that said, "I get it, I'm the joke," while my mind catalogued every detail, every snort, every roll of the eyes. I think of that as the first seed of my strategic patience. Learn the pattern, memorize the weaknesses, wait for the opportunity. The sensory memory is vivid. The chalk dust in the air, the sticky heat of the classroom in May, the echo of the bells signaling freedom, and the metallic tang of anxiety on my tongue. Sometimes I would replay the laughter in my head late at night, like a soundtrack I couldn't mute. And in the weirdest, quietest corners of my room, I began to appreciate my voice for what it was, a curious, slightly offbeat instrument. Sure, it got me mocked, but it was unique. It had a timbre that demanded attention, even if that attention was filled with snickers at first. I remember one joke that still makes me grin privately. During a group reading, one girl whispered, "Sounds like he's trying to talk through a sock." I didn't get angry, not then. I laughed softly, imagining a sock with tiny teeth chewing my words. It was absurd, cartoonish, and secretly, it made me practice my enunciation that much harder. Humor became my shield, my lens to view humiliation not as a wound but as material for improvement. Like a gamer who dies repeatedly to learn a boss pattern, I collected every taunt, every derisive chuckle, and logged it in the hidden part of my brain labeled future fuel. Walking home after school, I would pass the corner store and mutter to myself lines I overheard or invented. I tried accents from commercials, radio DJs, and even old movie trailers, experimenting with the vibration of my voice, its range, its cadence. The world outside the classroom felt quieter, safer, and I could test my sound without judgment. I discovered that I enjoyed the sensation of my voice carrying in the air, bouncing off brick walls, rustling leaves, mingling with the smell of hot asphalt and old tires. I was training in secret, like a boxer shadowboxing alone in the alley, each word a jab, each phrase a hook. Even in those early moments, I could sense the irony brewing. The very voice they mocked, the one they labeled country boy, was becoming my instrument of control. I couldn't yet imagine the specifics, but I knew one day it would matter. And so, I smiled, nodded, and endured, all the while rehearsing in my mind, learning inflections, rhythms, and tones. My quiet rebellion was auditory, a slow-motion metamorphosis happening behind closed doors. By the end of the school year, I had developed a dual identity, one for them, polite, self-conscious, almost invisible, and one for me, creative, exploratory, resonant. That contrast became the engine of my inner life, the beginning of a long story that would one day flip the tables. I could see them clearly now, the kids who mocked me, laughing at their own ease and ignorance, not knowing that the country boy's voice was quietly tuning itself into an instrument of future satisfaction. It was absurd and beautiful in equal measure. The same voice that had been a source of ridicule would become my signature, my subtle, playful revenge. After months of enduring the classroom performances, I decided on a strategy that no one noticed at first: silence. I stopped raising my hand, I stopped volunteering to read aloud, and I stopped reacting to the whispers and giggles that once felt like tiny darts aimed straight at my ego. I became the quiet background music of the classroom, there, but unobtrusive, easy to ignore. It was not defeat, it was reconnaissance. Every smirk, every sideways glance, every muttered joke was catalogued. I learned how to anticipate patterns of cruelty, the rhythms of laughter, the exact inflection that meant we're talking about you again. It was fascinating in a slightly masochistic way. Imagine watching ants carry breadcrumbs while you sit safely on a chair above them, sketching a map in your head. You are part of the ecosystem, yet untouched by the chaos. I would write notes to myself during class, jotting down phrases I overheard: accent, country boy, mule, sock. Later, I'd practice them in the mirror, exaggerating the vowels, rolling the R's with precision, perfecting what they thought was my weakness. I even started recording my voice on a cheap phone, listening to the playback in secret, noting how it resonated differently than in the classroom. There's a peculiar intimacy in hearing your own speech magnified, flaws included. You notice every hesitation, every quirky pause, every accidental musicality, and for the first time, I realized that my so-called flaws were actually character, like the scratchy patina on a vintage vinyl record, giving it warmth and uniqueness. Lunchtimes were still a minefield. The boys would whisper and point, but I learned to give them nothing but polite nods and an occasional half-smile. They didn't know that their laughter had become a kind of fuel, energizing a quiet, smoldering plan. And humor, the one thing that had helped me survive, became a secret weapon. I would imagine sarcastic comebacks that I never delivered out loud, like tiny fireworks bursting in my brain. One day I thought, maybe if I order a burger with a French accent, they'll explode in confusion. And I chuckled alone in the cafeteria, the sandwich tasting like victory. It was absurd, and yet the absurdity was comforting. I also began observing other students more closely. The popular kids who mocked me were surprisingly predictable. The leader laughed first, the followers copied, and the girl who had once whispered about the sock voice always found a way to add a soft giggle at just the right moment. I noted their behaviors in my head like a scientist observing wildlife. The thing about patterns is, once you recognize them, you're no longer a victim, you become the strategist. I started practicing subtle manipulations in daily conversation, timing my words, adjusting my tone to elicit certain reactions. I wasn't cruel. I was merely exercising control over the smallest stage of my life. I began retreating more intentionally to the quiet spaces of the school. Library corners, empty hallways, under staircases where the air smelled of dust and old paint. Here, I could speak aloud without judgment, experimenting with pitch, rhythm, and pronunciation. I imagined my voice not as a flaw but as a musical instrument, one that could bend and twist in ways no one expected. I would recite lines from commercials I overheard on TV, mixing accents and inflections, creating an internal symphony of absurdity and art. Sometimes I even sang off-key and hilarious, allowing the sound to vibrate through the empty rooms, making me feel invisible yet profoundly present. And then, slowly, something unexpected happened. I started enjoying my own voice. What once was a source of embarrassment became a playground of potential. I would whisper lines to myself at night, laughing quietly when they sounded silly or exaggerated. There's a kind of secret joy in loving something that the world once mocked. I began to feel like a magician learning the secret incantations, a cook experimenting with flavors no one thought would work together, or a gamer mastering a level everyone else failed. My accent, once a label of ridicule, became the defining mark of my identity, something no one could imitate convincingly, something that was uniquely mine. By the end of that year, my quiet retaliation was well underway. I hadn't confronted anyone, hadn't delivered one witty comeback or loud protest, but in the safety of my own space, I had rehearsed, trained, and refined my voice, turning it into a tool of self-discovery and preparation. The laughter of my classmates no longer wounded me. It was merely an echo bouncing off the walls of my own private concert hall, where I was both audience and performer. And in that silence I realized something profound. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly, tuning itself patiently until the right moment to strike. Looking back, I can almost laugh at my former self for worrying so much. The irony is delicious. The very attention that once humiliated me had also pointed me toward my secret path, a path that would one day lead to recognition, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of ironic revenge. And so as I left the classroom each day, head held just slightly lower than my pride allowed, I felt an inner calm, a subtle excitement, and a soft growing confidence that the country boy was learning to play a much larger game. Nightfall became my rehearsal hall. In the dim light of my bedroom, I would perch on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, reading aloud lines I copied from television commercials, radio spots, and even YouTube ads I shouldn't have been allowed to watch at 13. My voice filled the small space, echoing slightly off the walls, bouncing back to me with a resonance that felt oddly triumphant. I practiced pacing, enunciation, and subtle emotional cues, softly, then louder, experimenting with the way words could carry meaning beyond their definitions. By now, my accent wasn't a flaw, it was a signature. I began to notice, almost giddily, how it could make a mundane sentence feel dramatic or an ordinary ad feel inviting. It was a secret superpower, and no one knew. I remember one evening, mumbling through a mock ad for a local electronics store, imagining the shocked faces of my classmates. Get your best deals on the latest gadgets. Delivered right to your home. I emphasized the words best in gadgets, adding a small theatrical pause between phrases. The performance was ridiculous, of course, and the poor cat on my bed gave me a judgmental stare, but the thrill was intoxicating. There's something soothing about creating a world in which your voice is a tool of authority, even if the audience is a carpet and a tabby who has heard it all before. I laughed quietly, the sound of my own words feeling more like music than mockery. Some nights I would add exaggerated accents to certain syllables just for fun, testing the limits of how far I could stretch or twist my inflections. Bargains here, at your fingertips. I whispered in a mock British lilt, then tried a sing-sangy, almost cartoonish version. My laughter echoed, blending with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. In those moments, I felt a curious blend of absurdity and empowerment. It was like discovering an old camera in the attic and realizing it could capture secret worlds no one else knew existed. My voice became a landscape, a sandbox of infinite possibility. The more I experimented, the more I noticed subtle nuances in my own speech I had never appreciated before. There were tones that conveyed warmth, even humor. Pauses that could make a phrase linger and resonate, and rhythms that felt like miniature stories within sentences. Every whispered laugh of my classmates became a stepping stone. Every mocking word a rough edge I could sand down, refine, and eventually polish. I began to understand that mastery isn't about perfection, it's about curiosity, persistence, and a willingness to play. And boy, did I play. Sometimes I sounded like a late-night radio host, sometimes like a slightly unhinged infomercial personality, and occasionally like an earnest narrator of a nature documentary. The versatility thrilled me, like discovering an all-access backstage pass to a theater I didn't even know I'd auditioned for. I also started to record my experiments, using a small, clunky voice recorder I found buried in a drawer. I would listen back, critique, laugh, and repeat. The first few recordings were cringeworthy. I sounded like a frog with a microphone, but each attempt improved. Soon, I began layering subtle inflections, adding comedic timing, and testing different cadences. I even attempted a soft ASMR effect for certain sentences, whispering lines so gently that I could hear the friction of air against my lips. It was oddly soothing, an intimate dialogue with my own voice. I started to notice that the better I became at modulating my tone, the more control I felt over how others might perceive me someday. The irony wasn't lost on me. My tormentors had sparked this obsession. Occasionally, I'd imagined delivering a real commercial one day. A client, impressed by my accent, my timing, and my idiosyncratic tone, would call me in. I would stand in a recording studio, headphones on, microphone polished, and my country twang would suddenly be an asset, a charm point, a reason people listened. I envisioned the faces of those who laughed at me, wondering if they could recognize the boy whose voice they once mocked. It was absurdly satisfying and somehow motivating. I found myself grinning in the dark, whispering lines that only my walls would hear, each phrase a rehearsal for a future that didn't yet exist. Humor remained a constant companion. Sometimes I would invent ridiculous scenarios, reading a commercial for invisible socks or pet rock insurance, just to hear how my accent could transform absurdity into credibility. My cat, now a seasoned critic, remained unimpressed, but I didn't care. These exercises weren't just for skill. They were rituals of affirmation, reminders that my voice, no matter how country it sounded, could evoke laughter, attention, or even admiration in the right context. I was building confidence in secret, sculpting it syllable by syllable, and as I practiced night after night, something magical happened. I began to enjoy the rhythm of my own speech. The quirks I once feared became playful tools, the pauses, the elongations, the exaggerated consonants. They were now instruments in a symphony only I could conduct. The boy who had been laughed at, mocked, and whispered about was transforming quietly, carefully, and deliciously. One day my voice wouldn't just be tolerated, it would be celebrated. The first break came unexpectedly, like a soft knock on a door I didn't know was locked. A local business, a small radio station in the neighboring town, put out a call for voices for a short commercial. It was modest, a 30-second spot about a new line of kitchen gadgets. But I recognized an opportunity the moment I heard it. I submitted a recording I had made in my bedroom, experimenting with pacing, warmth, and inflection, and then waited. Days crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, and I tried not to obsess over whether anyone would like it. But of course, I did obsess. I played the recording on repeat, each time imagining the announcer's voice replaced with my own, feeling a thrill that mingled with the familiar sting of anxiety. Then, one morning, my mum burst into my room, holding a tiny letter with the logo of the station. "They want you to record it professionally," she said, eyes wide, tone a mixture of pride and disbelief. My stomach flipped, a combination of elation and terror. I was going to step into a studio for the first time, to be recorded professionally, to perform for people who didn't know me, didn't know my history, didn't mock me as country boy. For once, my voice would matter without apology. I felt a mix of absurdity and thrill. What if I mispronounced something? What if my accent was too rustic? And then, inevitably, what if it actually worked? The studio smelled like polished wood and electronics, a faint aroma of coffee and vinyl lingering in the air. I felt oddly adult, stepping behind the microphone, headphones snug over my ears. The engineer smiled, a reassuring presence, and I began. I delivered the lines with care, imagining a warm, inviting voice that drew listeners in. I played with tempo, pitch, and subtle comedic timing, inserting little flourishes that made the words pop without being over the top. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same inflections that had once drawn snickers in a middle school classroom were now the tools of my first professional success. I couldn't help but smirk under the headphones, imagining the faces of the classmates who had mocked me. When the commercial aired that week on local radio, I listened from my room, headphones hugging my ears. Volume low so my parents wouldn't overhear my sudden shrieks of joy. My voice came across as confident, quirky, and warm. People called in, complimented the ad, laughed at the clever phrasing, and, in some cases, remarked how catchy the voice sounded. Each compliment felt like a small victory, a breadcrumb leading me away from the memory of ridicule and toward the intoxicating taste of validation. My phone buzzed with notifications, and I couldn't help but think, this is it. The first taste of recognition, and it was sweeter than I'd imagined. Of course, the humor of the situation wasn't lost on me. I texted my closest friend, who had been privy to my nightly rehearsals, saying, "Remember the sock comment? My voice is now literally on the radio. Take that, invisible footwear." We both laughed until our sides hurt. The absurdity of private practice turning into public triumph, too good not to celebrate. I felt like a magician revealing a trick slowly, savoring each gasp from an audience that had never suspected the preparation behind the curtain. The experience also taught me something crucial. My voice could transcend context. What had been a source of embarrassment in a classroom filled with teenagers was now a professional asset. I could manipulate tone, inflection, and cadence to evoke specific emotions. I could make a sentence feel urgent, inviting, or playful. This realization sparked a new obsession. I wanted to explore the full spectrum of what my voice could do. I began imagining scenarios far beyond kitchen gadgets, narrating documentaries, voicing commercials for global brands, or even doing character work for animations. Each possibility expanded my sense of self, proving that mockery had an unexpected upside. And yet, I didn't boast about it at school. In fact, I remained my quiet self, a phantom in the hallways, keeping my burgeoning talent a secret. The irony was delicious. The very classmates who had laughed at me had no idea that the country boy was slowly building a professional skill they would someday admire, maybe even envy. I smiled to myself, recognizing that this secrecy added a layer of satisfaction to my early triumph. Victory tasted better when it was quietly savored, like chocolate melting slowly on your tongue. I also learned to appreciate the tactile, sensory side of this new world. The studio equipment, the subtle hum of the console, the soft thrum of the speakers, even the slight pressure of the microphone against my lips. It all contributed to a meditative state, a focused calm. Each recording session became a ritual, a chance to merge technique with intuition, humor with subtlety, and personality with professionalism. I began to see voice work not just as a career path, but as a form of artistry, a playground for someone who had once been laughed at for the way he spoke. By the end of that first project, I felt a profound shift. The ridicule of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer held power over me. My voice was mine, and it could be wielded with precision, creativity, and joy. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a mischievous thought lingered. Those who mocked me would someday have no choice but to listen, and maybe, just maybe, appreciate the very thing they had once scorned. The first whispers of recognition came slowly, almost like the tip of a wave brushing the shore before the tide fully arrived. I was walking through a small shopping center when I overheard a familiar tone crackle from the speakers of a clothing store. My voice, not mine, exactly. It was refined, polished, professionally recorded, but unmistakably, undeniably, my own. I froze mid-step, the weight of realization pressing into my chest. People passed by, oblivious, yet there I was, caught between disbelief and a rush of thrill. My voice, once a source of ridicule, was now an audible presence in public spaces, commanding attention without me even being visible. Then came the more complicated part. Old classmates began to notice. At first, subtle comments arrived through social media, cryptic messages, and shared links. "Wait, is that him?" Some tagged friends, asking, half joking, half serious, if the voice in a radio ad sounded familiar. The confusion, the uncertainty, the slow dawning realization, they all played out in my favor. I watched from a distance, quietly savoring the irony. The same people who once mocked me for my accent now had no idea that the boy they laughed at was the voice they couldn't stop replaying. It was especially satisfying during those rare moments when a class reunion or neighborhood gossip thread brought names into conversation. I could feel their hesitation in typing messages. The brief pause before admitting that yes, the country boy was now talented, perhaps even enviable. Their amusement at my earlier speech was replaced with curiosity, and, if I read correctly, a little unspoken envy. I chuckled quietly, the sound low and private, imagining a scenario where I could nonchalantly reveal my identity. But why spoil the fun? Patience, I reminded myself, was a flavor sweeter than immediate satisfaction. The funny thing about recognition is that it can come in unpredictable packages. One day a friend of a friend texted me, "Your voice is in the ad that just aired in 3 states. Are you kidding me?" I laughed quietly to myself, picturing my classmates' faces if they could hear the exact same lines that were now being broadcast widely. The absurdity of it all, the tiny boy mocked for elongated vowels now reaching a mass audience, was both surreal and satisfying. I imagined the inside jokes, the whispered taunts, and how they must have sounded ridiculous when the tables had turned. Of course, the humor didn't erase the memories entirely. Sometimes I would catch myself recalling the precise way a particular student sneered at my accent, the way a teacher had overlooked my potential, or the way I had sat quietly, cheeks burning, pretending everything was fine. These memories, though tinged with discomfort, were now part of the tapestry of my rise. They were threads woven into the fabric of my success, giving it texture, contrast, and depth. Without them, my triumph wouldn't feel nearly as rich, nearly as satisfying. And yet, amid the growing recognition, I remained careful. I didn't flaunt my growing career at school. I didn't gloat or rub it in anyone's face. There was something elegant in subtlety, in letting people discover, piece by piece, that the boy they had mocked was quietly becoming someone remarkable. I smiled to myself, imagining the eventual realization that it wasn't just luck. It was patience, practice, and a willingness to transform ridicule into skill. The irony was delicious. Their initial cruelty had been the catalyst, unintentionally nurturing the very talent they would one day admire. I started to notice small reactions in other ways. Store clerks, radio hosts, even strangers on the street would comment, compliment, or mimic the cadence of my voice. I reveled in these subtle affirmations, savoring the knowledge that my voice carried charm, warmth, and credibility. And with each new project, each new recording, I honed my craft further, experimenting with subtle inflections, humor, and pacing. The classroom taunts had been a trial by fire, and I had emerged tempered, skillful, and, importantly, patient. Humor remained a constant companion. One evening, listening to a compilation of ads I had voiced, I whispered to myself, from mule jokes to million-dollar campaigns, who would have thought? My voice, once a source of embarrassment, was now an instrument of empowerment. I laughed softly at the absurdity, picturing my former classmates scratching their heads as they heard the same accent they once mocked, now broadcasting on national platforms. It was subtle, quiet revenge, one that required no confrontation, only the slow, sweet satisfaction of being recognized on my own terms. By the end of that phase, I felt a shift in how I perceived myself. The insecure boy who had once tensed at laughter in classrooms was now a professional, aware of his unique value and ready to explore the full potential of his voice. Recognition, both subtle and public, had transformed from a distant dream into a tangible reality. And as I walked through life hearing snippets of my own work echo in unexpected places, I felt a deep, abiding satisfaction. The mocking laughter of my past was no longer a wound, it was the fuel that had propelled me forward. The rising career felt like stepping onto a conveyor belt that I had secretly constructed myself. One commercial led to another, and soon I was juggling projects for local businesses, online campaigns, and small radio spots across the region. Each time, I discovered nuances in my voice I hadn't realized before, a softer tone that evoked trust, a sharper cadence that sparked attention, and subtle humor that could make mundane slogans memorable. The irony was intoxicating. The same vocal quirks once laughed at were now carefully curated tools, honed with the precision of a craftsman. It was during one particularly intense week that I understood the full power of my transformation. I was recording a series of ads for a national home improvement brand, the kind of campaign that would air in dozens of cities simultaneously. In the studio, I slid headphones over my ears and glanced at the script. The words seemed ordinary, but in my hands, or rather my voice, they became something more. I paused, emphasized, whispered and projected, manipulating the cadence until the lines danced naturally. It was a performance invisible to the naked eye, yet utterly commanding through sound alone, and somewhere I imagined my old classmates, probably still using the same glib tone they once mocked, unaware that their own laughter had been the first step toward this moment. Humor remained my companion, a quiet spice that I wove into every session. During one recording, I whispered a tagline in such an exaggerated accent that even the engineer, a veteran with decades of experience, stifled a laugh. "That's unique," he said, smiling wryly. I smirked, imagining the classroom echoes from years ago, the sock jokes, the mule quips, the whispered insults. In each case, the laughter had been my teacher. I had learned timing, inflection, and the subtle art of commanding attention, all while smiling quietly to myself. The sensory aspects of my work became a kind of meditation. The hum of the microphone, the faint vibration of the soundboard, and the warm pressure of headphones against my ears. It all created a private sanctuary where I could experiment and perfect my craft. I learned to feel the resonance of my own voice in my chest, throat, and lips, adjusting tone as intuitively as a pianist adjusting pressure on keys. Each recording session became a ritual, a quiet dance of subtle control and playful experimentation. I discovered the sheer joy of molding sound into something that could influence, charm, and entertain. I also observed how people reacted to my work without ever seeing me. Positive feedback flowed in emails, social media tags, and occasional calls from clients. "Your voice brought our campaign to life," one client said. Another wrote, "It's exactly what we needed, warm, approachable, and confident." Each comment was a small affirmation, a quiet celebration of the transformation that had begun in the whispered mockery of classrooms long ago. Every piece of recognition reinforced the truth I had known in secret. My voice was my power, and I could wield it as subtly or boldly as I pleased. And yet, I maintained discretion. I didn't flaunt my success at school or in public spaces where classmates might recognize me. There was elegance and subtlety in letting people discover talent slowly, without forcing admiration or confrontation. In the rare moments when someone mentioned my voice, I smiled politely, careful not to betray the satisfaction simmering beneath the surface. There was power in restraint, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that their eventual realization would be entirely mine to savor. Humor, reflection, and subtle irony were constant companions. One evening, reviewing a series of ads I had voiced, I whispered to myself, "From mule jokes to million-dollar campaigns, who knew?" I laughed softly, imagining their faces the same ones who had ridiculed me. Suddenly confronted by the impact of the voice they had once mocked, it was quiet revenge, delivered not with confrontation but with subtle mastery, an invisible hand guiding attention and admiration toward me. As my reputation grew, I realized that the skill I had developed wasn't just technical, it was psychological. I had learned patience, observation, and the art of timing, abilities that extended far beyond voice work. Every sneer and whisper of my past had become a lesson in subtle power, teaching me to move deliberately, listen carefully, and shape perception without ever raising my own volume. The country boy had become a quiet orchestrator of attention, a presence felt without being seen. By the end of this period, I was no longer the insecure, self-conscious boy who had dreaded the sound of laughter. I was a professional, a student of sound, and a master of irony. My career, modest at first, now provided a stage for creativity, humor, and subtle influence, and deep inside I felt a quiet thrill. The mockery of the past had not destroyed me. It had honed me, polished me, and ultimately transformed me into someone impossible to ignore. The reunion arrived sooner than I expected, a sudden collision of past and present. Invitations came via email and social media, a polite reminder that time had moved on and, with it, the awkward hierarchies of adolescence. I considered not going. After all, what would be the point of mingling with the same people who once mocked every syllable I spoke? And yet, a small, mischievous part of me knew this would be the perfect moment to observe, to measure, and perhaps, ever so subtly, to assert the quiet power I had been cultivating for years. So I agreed, keeping my expectations deliberately low, but my mind tuned sharply to every potential interaction. Walking into the hall, I saw familiar faces stretched and reshaped by time. Some were instantly recognizable, while others had grown into strangers hiding in old shells. I smiled politely, nodding to a few while noticing that the subtle tension of adolescent bravado still lingered. In some, the slight stiffness in posture, the calculated laugh, the way eyes darted just a fraction too quickly when mine met theirs. It was as though the past, a dormant seed, had been awakened by the soft echo of recognition. And I, quietly, held the remote control. I wasn't here to gloat. I was here to observe, savor, and perhaps enjoy the tiny cracks of surprise I could detect. They didn't know, of course, that my voice, the same one that had been ridiculed in classrooms and hallways, had become the unseen star of campaigns they admired. I caught snippets of conversation. "Did you hear that ad on the radio?" "Yeah, the one with that really distinctive voice." Their eyebrows knit together in puzzlement, curiosity mingling with a touch of envy. I smiled softly, my lips barely moving, a private joke playing across my mind. No words needed to be spoken. The irony of the situation was more satisfying for being quiet, simmering beneath polite smiles and casual banter. I navigated the reunion like a gentle tide, approaching groups with careful grace, listening more than speaking. When I did speak, my voice, naturally, effortlessly, carried a resonance that drew attention without effort. There was warmth, humor, and confidence, each word shaped with the subtle skill I had honed over countless nights of secret practice. One of the girls who had once whispered sock voice greeted me with a soft, uncertain smile. I returned it with mild amusement, and though the exchange was brief, I could sense the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had heard my voice countless times on the airwaves. She had heard me before she knew it was me. The realization, I imagined, was almost disorienting. The event itself was a blend of nostalgia and mild chaos, laughter punctuating recollections of adolescent mishaps. I participated lightly, letting stories unfold around me, gently inserting myself where appropriate. I found joy in the subtle irony. Those who once defined social hierarchies through mockery now navigated interactions with a careful politeness, occasionally faltering when my voice entered the conversation. My laughter, soft and unforced, blended into the ambience, a reminder that I could participate without needing to dominate, yet always maintaining control of the situation. Humor continued to guide me. During a conversation about old school plays, someone remarked on a particularly awkward reading. I nodded, chuckling softly. "I guess some things never change," I said lightly. The room responded with polite laughter, but I caught the micro-expression, a flicker of discomfort, on the face of a former tormentor. Timing, subtlety, and a bit of irony. 3 ingredients I had mastered long before they realized it. And the best part, no confrontation, no loud vindication. Just quiet, understated satisfaction that only I fully appreciated. The evening carried on, and I noticed another shift. People began sharing stories of the ads I had voiced, complimenting the skill and versatility without knowing they were speaking to the man behind the microphone. I smiled, inwardly savoring the layers of irony. The classroom laughter, the whispered insults, the ridicule, they had not broken me. Instead, they had been the furnace in which my voice, patience, and skill were forged. The boy who had once slouched cheeks burning had become an observer of human behavior, a conductor of subtle attention, and, indirectly, the orchestrator of admiration. By the end of the reunion, I realized the full scope of my quiet triumph. I had faced the past, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with mastery of my craft, my voice, and my perception. The laughter that once wounded me had been transformed into strategy, growth, and subtle, delicious revenge. I left the hall with a calm satisfaction, the soft echo of recognition trailing behind me. In a way, the reunion was not about proving anything to anyone. It was about witnessing the fruition of years of patience, practice, and playful resilience. Subtle revenge doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It drifts in quietly, like honey slowly dripping over toast, sticky and inevitable. The first time I realized just how delicious it could be was when one of my former tormentors, now a manager at a growing advertising company, called me for a voiceover project. Their company was producing national campaigns, and they needed a voice that conveyed trust, warmth, and charm. Exactly what my accent, refined over years of practice, could deliver. The irony was rich, almost decadent. The very people who once mocked the country boy were now relying on him to sell ideas, products, and image to the nation. I remember the first meeting vividly. Sitting in the studio, microphone poised, I felt an electric mix of amusement and anticipation. The client, unaware of our shared past, outlined the project, a series of ads to be aired nationwide, carefully scripted, timed, and infused with subtle humor. I nodded, taking notes, all the while savoring the private knowledge that my voice, once a source of ridicule, was now the company's secret weapon. Each inflection, each pause, each subtle nuance would carry weight, credibility, and a touch of playfulness. I smiled softly under my breath, imagining the astonishment of old classmates if they had seen me now. Recording began, and I slipped seamlessly into the role. Warmth, humor, authority, they flowed naturally, sculpted by years of private rehearsal, countless nights spent speaking to walls, ceilings, and the cat who had long since stopped judging me. I experimented with pacing and tone, sprinkling subtle irony and humor into the lines, just enough to keep the ads lively and memorable. The engineer nodded approvingly, the sound bouncing back from the speakers rich and resonant. It was everything I had imagined: control, mastery, and the quiet satisfaction of poetic justice. The first campaign aired, and the response was immediate. Feedback poured in, praising the voice, the charm, and the subtle humor that carried through every line. My colleagues at the company complimented the professionalism and personality embedded in the recordings. I listened, smiling quietly, knowing the full irony. The very people who had once sneered at my speech were now singing its praises, albeit unknowingly. It was subtle, elegant, and far more satisfying than any overt confrontation could have been. I was invisible yet omnipresent, acknowledged in whispers, appreciated in public, and fully aware of the delicious twist of fate. Humor, of course, remained a constant. I imagined the sarcastic commentary I might offer if I revealed the truth. Remember that kid you called Mule Voice? Well, now he's your secret weapon on national television. The thought made me laugh softly, the kind of quiet chuckle that no one else could hear. It was ironic, playful, and entirely mine, a personal triumph wrapped in subtlety. I had become both the storyteller and the story, the orchestrator and the instrument, quietly reshaping the narrative of my past. This subtle revenge extended beyond personal satisfaction. It became a lens through which I viewed all interactions, a way of observing power, perception, and influence. I realized that control doesn't always roar. It hums, it whispers, it carries authority in ways that demand attention without demanding confrontation. I could be present in a room without dominating it, admired without boasting, and remembered without appearing. The power of subtlety, I discovered, was far richer and more enduring than any overt display of success. Each new project deepened this understanding. I worked with clients across industries, tech, fashion, automotive, and each time, my voice became the invisible bridge between idea and audience. The very quirks that had been mocked were now the defining strengths of my professional persona: warmth, approachability, and a subtle charm that could make even a mundane product feel engaging. I was no longer the awkward boy hiding from ridicule. I was a craftsman of sound, a manipulator of perception, and, quietly, a connoisseur of irony. By the end of this phase, I had transformed the lingering sting of mockery into something far richer: influence, recognition, and the elegant satisfaction of subtle revenge. The classroom laughter, once sharp and painful, had become the fuel that powered my mastery. And in quiet moments, listening to a finished campaign, I allowed myself a private grin, knowing that the country boy they once dismissed had not only survived, but had subtly, unmistakably, triumphed. Reflection became a favorite pastime. In quiet evenings, often with a cup of coffee growing lukewarm at my side, I would replay the journey in my mind, the boy who had been laughed at, mocked, and whispered about, and the man who now carried that very voice across living rooms and airwaves nationwide. I found humor in the small absurdities along the way, the exaggerated vowels, the mule jokes, the whispered commentary about socks and accents. They had been tiny sparks of humiliation, yes, but also the unexpected catalysts for growth. I chuckled softly to myself, a warm, self-assured laugh that seemed to resonate better in the spaces that mattered. My own head, my own carefully curated universe. I remembered the countless nights spent speaking to walls, ceilings, and the cat who had grown indifferent to my antics. It had all seemed ridiculous at the time, an awkward, obsessive ritual. But those exercises had become the training ground for mastery. I could now manipulate tone, cadence, and subtle humor in ways that made listeners pause, smile, or pay attention. Every inflection, every pause, every exaggerated syllable had been an investment, one that now yielded dividends far beyond what my teenage self could have imagined. The past, once a source of shame, had become a rich tapestry of learning, rehearsal, and private amusement. Humor continued to weave through my reflections. I would whisper to myself, from mule jokes to million-dollar campaigns, quite the upgrade, huh? The absurdity of it all was delightful, the irony delicious, and as I replayed snippets of my old classmates' shocked recognition, the memory of whispered mockery morphed into a satisfying contrast. The awkward boy, now a composed professional, the unseen hand behind voices that commanded attention, respect, and admiration. No confrontation had been necessary. The satisfaction lay in subtlety, in the transformation itself. I also reflected on the emotional nuances of my journey, the insecurity, the embarrassment, the feeling of being less than in the eyes of my peers. These experiences had shaped me. They had taught patience, observation, and the art of listening, all skills that now enhanced my craft. I had learned to read people, to anticipate reactions, and to inject subtle humor or warmth exactly where it would land most effectively. The boy who had shrunk under laughter had become a man who orchestrated attention and perception with careful, deliberate intention. There was elegance in this quiet victory, a sense of control that felt infinitely more satisfying than public confrontation or overt boasting. I found joy in the modern comparisons to my voice, once likened to a mule ride or a sock chewing on words, now carried a kind of contemporary charm. Listeners described it as quirky, approachable, and memorable, an unusual blend that made brands more human and campaigns more engaging. In a way, my teenage tormentors had inadvertently trained me for the most 21st century of careers. Subtle influence delivered through tone, inflection, and carefully curated personality. I could imagine them scrolling through social media, puzzled, wondering how the country boy had become an invisible yet essential presence in national advertising. Humor, again, became a soothing refrain. I would quietly narrate absurd mental scenarios, former classmates trying to mimic my commercials, guessing at the subtleties of pacing, inflection, and timing they had once mocked. The mental image was comical, a private film of irony and poetic justice, and yet, the amusement never veered into cruelty. It was gentle, reflective, and a reminder of how far I had traveled. The transformation had been about skill, patience, and self-awareness, not revenge in the malicious sense. The satisfaction lay in mastery, subtlety, and the knowledge that I had, in my own quiet way, rewritten the narrative of my past. By the end of these reflections, I could appreciate the arc of my journey fully. The ridicule had been a crucible, the rehearsals a forge, the professional projects, the polishing. I was no longer defined by laughter or whispers, but by the skill, humor, and poise I had cultivated in response. Each commercial, each recording, each subtle nod of recognition from a listener was a testament to transformation, patience, and quiet triumph, and in that gentle realization, I found laughter, peace, and a deeply satisfying sense of completion. The awkward boy had become a calm orchestrator of admiration, respected, unseen, and entirely in control. The culmination came subtly, like a soft crescendo in a symphony I had composed for years. One morning, I received an invitation to narrate a national television campaign for a major company, a project that would air on screens across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same voice that had elicited ridicule in classrooms was now the one selling ideas, products, and lifestyle narratives to millions. I felt a shiver of satisfaction, tempered with a strange, calm joy. The country boy had not only survived ridicule, he had thrived, quietly and irresistibly. In the studio, the atmosphere was both exhilarating and intimate. The microphone loomed like a familiar companion rather than an instrument of judgment. I adjusted the headphones, noted the subtle hum of the equipment, and let my voice flow naturally, shaped by years of private practice and subtle mastery. Each line was carefully crafted, warmth in the right place, humor where it would catch attention, pauses that lent gravity without heaviness. The engineer smiled knowingly, a subtle nod indicating that I had captured precisely what the campaign needed. And as I listened to playback, the full impact struck me. My voice was now a professional instrument, commanding attention, evoking emotion, and carrying charm effortlessly. Humor remained a secret companion. I imagined my old classmates watching their favorite shows, hearing my voice in commercials, and pausing in confusion. Wait, that's him. The mental image made me chuckle softly, a private indulgence, and yet the satisfaction was quiet, understated, and infinitely more elegant than any overt retaliation could have been. This was a triumph not of confrontation, but of mastery, patience, and self-discovery. Every mocking word from the past had been a stepping stone toward this moment. Every whispered joke, every sideways glance, every chuckle aimed at my accent had been quietly collected, studied, and transformed into power. I thought about the contrast, The boy who had once felt humiliated by minor slips of pronunciation, whose confidence had wavered under the weight of laughter, now had the ability to shape perception with each inflection. The journey had taught me more than technical skill. It had taught me patience, observation, and the subtleties of influence. Humor, irony, and reflection had become tools of both craft and self-assurance. I smiled, savoring the realization that the power of subtlety far exceeded any fleeting satisfaction of revenge. My transformation was complete, silent, elegant, and utterly mine. The campaign aired, and the response was immediate. Social media buzzed with compliments on the voice, noting its warmth, charm, and distinctiveness. Emails arrived from clients and colleagues praising the performance, acknowledging the subtle humor and confidence embedded in each line, and somewhere in the background, I imagined my former classmates slowly piecing it together. The realization dawning gently, perhaps with a small flush of surprise or admiration. The satisfaction, quiet and internal, was richer than anything I could have orchestrated openly. Reflection deepened as I replayed the journey from childhood to now. Each setback, each moment of embarrassment, had been an invisible thread weaving the tapestry of my growth. The ridicule, the whispers, the laughter, once painful, had been the crucible in which patience, resilience, and creativity were forged. Humor had remained a constant ally, softening the journey, adding levity to the trials, and giving me perspective. My voice, once mocked, had become the instrument through which I silently claimed victory over the past. In quiet moments, I still practiced, still whispered lines to myself late at night, soft and playful, refining, exploring, experimenting. The joy of creation had become a form of meditation, a gentle, flowing rhythm that anchored me. I realized that the journey wasn't just about recognition, it was about mastery, self-discovery, and the quiet delight of knowing that the very thing once ridiculed was now celebrated. My past and present had intertwined in subtle, unexpected ways, teaching me lessons about resilience, patience, and the enduring power of quiet, deliberate craft. And as I stepped back from the microphone, letting the hum of the studio envelop me, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not vengeance, not shouting, not confrontation, but a calm, measured triumph. The boy who had been mocked had grown into the man whose voice carried influence, warmth, and subtle humor across a nation. The satisfaction was deep, quiet, and enduring, a testament to patience, skill, and the remarkable journey from insecurity to mastery. Now, let's slow down, ease into the quiet of reflection, and let the story settle like soft sand through gentle fingers. Imagine yourself sitting in a warm, dimly lit room, the hum of life outside softened, and the gentle rhythm of your own breath carrying you into calm awareness. The journey of the boy with the country voice has unfolded, each moment building subtly, patiently, until it blossomed into mastery. And now, we allow it to fade softly, like the lingering notes of a lullaby, resonating gently without urgency. There's a warmth here, a comfort in knowing that growth often comes quietly, in unobserved steps and whispered rehearsals. The laughter that once stung has been transformed into a soft, guiding force, a reminder that every misstep, every awkward moment, carries lessons if we choose to listen. You might picture the boy himself, smiling softly at the reflection in a studio mirror, feeling the gentle pulse of accomplishment, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet resonance of his own voice. Feel the softness of this calm spreading through your body. Shoulders release their tension, your jaw loosens, a gentle sigh escapes, carrying away lingering thoughts of haste or worry. The story has ended, but the lessons remain: patience, quiet persistence, humor in adversity, and the unexpected ways our perceived flaws can become our strengths. Each breath is steady, a soothing reminder that growth is a process, not a race, and that subtle victories can carry more satisfaction than any shouted triumph. Allow the images of the journey to drift, like clouds across a twilight sky. The classroom, the whispered mockery, the lonely nights of practice, the small victories, and finally, the subtle, quiet triumph on a national stage. They all float gently, like soft brushstrokes fading at the edges, leaving only a gentle glow. This is the moment to release, to trust that the story has carried its lessons, and to let your mind rest in the gentle cadence of reflection. And finally, in this soft, whispering space, the voice that once trembled now speaks quietly, confidently, and with warmth. Let that warmth fill your chest, echo softly through your thoughts, and guide you into a state of gentle peace. Every step of the journey has led here, and every breath affirms the quiet satisfaction of growth, resilience, and subtle mastery. Drift now, with a soft smile, into the calm, carrying the story with you, letting it settle into the comforting folds of memory.